Chapter 40. Beelzebub tells how people learned and again forgot about the fundamental cosmic law of Heptaparaparshinokh. After Beelzebub had listened to what was communicated in the Leitoochanbros handed to him, his grandson Hassan again turned to him and said, "My dear and kind grandfather, please help me to clear up for myself one contradiction which I do not understand and which does not accord with my logical confrontations. When you began your elucidations about the holy planet Purgatory, you enjoined me to try to take in everything you spoke about, without missing anything, and you also enjoined me constantly to maintain the intensive tension of my active mentation, so that corresponding data for the formation of the notion relating to every question explaining the details of both primordial fundamental sacred cosmic laws should be completely crystallized in me. I did indeed try during all your elucidations to do so, and it seems to me I cleared up so much for myself about these cosmic laws that I could perhaps even freely explain them to someone else. In any case, I can already very well represent to myself the sacred law of Triamazikamno, with the particularities of all three of its sacred independent forces, and cognize it for my personal essence quite satisfactorily. But as regards the sacred law of Heptaparaparshinokh, then, although I have not yet fully cleared up to my reason certain of its, in my opinion, unimportant details, nevertheless I hope that with a little more active pondering I shall understand them as well. Now, however, after I had, while trying to assimilate well these sacred laws, clearly sensed and I became aware that they are very complicated and in general difficult for a complete understanding, it suddenly greatly astonished me and continues to astonish and interest me how the three-brained beings who arise and exist on the planet Earth could not only understand these sacred cosmic laws, but could even have constated them among the surrounding cosmic results, because from all your tales about them, I got the full impression that since the second Transapalnian perturbation there, when each of the newly arising results of theirs becomes a responsible being, he becomes, thanks to the abnormal prevailing Oskiano, the possessor of only automatic reason, and that it is impossible to understand both of these sacred cosmic laws with such a reason, I became convinced with the whole of my essence when I myself tried to understand them. Having said this, Hassan looked questioningly and eagerly at his beloved grandfather. Having thought a little, Beelzebub began to speak as follows. "All right, my dear boy. I shall try to elucidate to you also about this natural perplexity which justly arises within you. It seems to me I already once told you that although from the period you mentioned on that planet almost all the three-brained beings there became, thanks to the abnormally established conditions of ordinary being existence, possessors of only an automatic reason. Nevertheless, it does sometimes happen there that certain of them by chance escape this common fate, and that instead of that automatic reason, which has become usual there, a genuine objective being reason is formed in certain of them, as it is in all three center beings of our great Meglocosmos. Although such exceptions, especially during recent centuries, are very rare there, yet, I repeat, they nevertheless do occur. In order that you may approximately represent to yourself and understand just how such exceptions may occur among them, you must first of all know that, in spite of the fact that from the time when all the consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer began to be crystallized in them, it became proper to them to have automatic reason during their responsible existence. Yet, nevertheless, always and up to the present time, at the arising and the beginning of the formation of each one of them, there is always in their presence the germs of all possibilities for the crystallization, during their completing formation into responsible beings, of corresponding being data, which later, during responsible existence, could serve for the engendering and functioning of objective reason, which should be in the common presences of three-brained beings of all natures and of all external forms, and which, in itself, is nothing else but, so to say, the representative of the very essence of divinity. There, in the objective sense, extreme misfortune about that which you yourself already perplexedly instinctively suspect, as I discern from the formulation of your question, especially from your having mentioned Oskiano, consists just in this, that they, having indeed at their arising such possibilities in themselves, immediately fall from the very first days after the separation from their mother's womb, only thanks to the abnormalities established in the process of ordinary being existence of beings around them who have already reached responsible age, under the stubborn influence of that maleficent means, invented by them themselves for themselves, which, as I already told you, represent in itself a something of the kind of Oskiano which they call education. And in consequence, in this way, all possibilities for the free formation of all that which is required for the engendering of objective being reason is gradually atrophied, and finally disappears in these unfortunate, so to say, still innocent in everything, newly arising beings during the period of their what is called preparatory age. And as a result, when these newly arising beings later became responsible beings, they, in their, so to say, essence center of gravity, become the possessors, not of that objective reason which they ought to have, but of that strange totality of automatically perceived, artificial, even deceptive impressions which, having nothing in common with the localization of their spiritualized being parts, nevertheless acquires a connection with the separate functionings of their common presence. In consequence of this, not only the whole process of their existence flows automatically, but also almost the whole process of the functioning of their planetary body becomes dependent only on chance, automatically perceived, external impressions. In very rare cases, certain of these favorites of yours who have reached a responsible age become possessors of genuine, pure reason, proper to three-brained responsible beings. This usually proceeds there thus. For instance, it happens that immediately after the separation from his mother's womb, one of the newly arising beings finds himself, for the process of his subsequent formation, among such surrounding conditions, where for some reason or other all kinds of those abnormalities, with which the entire process of the external being existence of three-brained beings breeding on this ill-fated planet is already overfilled. Do not touch him, and do not influence him automatically, maleficently. And in consequence of this, the germs which are in him for the possibilities of acquiring pure reason have not the time during the process of his subsequent formation to become atrophied to the very root. And further, it sometimes also happens that for the subsequent completing formation of such a three-brained being there, newly arisen in the said relatively normal conditions, his responsible guide during his preparatory age for responsible existence is such a three-brained being as had before this, also of course by chance, already been completely formed in the same way, and in the functioning of whose waking consciousness, thanks to the frequent actualization in his presence of being Partkdolg-duty, there had participated the data which had remained whole in his subconscious, for the engendering of the divine impulse of conscience. And so, this same guide, being aware with the whole of his being of the important significance of this responsibility taking upon himself in relation to this new being who has, in the said manner, only as yet reached his preparatory age, begins, according to conscience, impartially to create for his Oskiano every kind of what are called inner and outer factors, for the perceiving of corresponding impressions, in order to crystallize in his common presence all those data, the totality of which alone can give to the three-brained being who has reached responsible age the power to be Svolibroonolnian, or, as your favorites there on earth would say, the potency not to be identified with and not to be affected by externals through one's inevitably inherent passions. And this being impulse engendered in the being with these data can alone help him to acquire the possibility of a free and impartial constatation of all true phenomena appearing in the cosmic results around him. Here it is very opportune to repeat once again that on most planets of our Meglocosmos, on which three-brained beings arise and exist, there is an oft-repeated sentence, formulated in the following words: Our common Father Endlessness is only the maker of a three-centered being. The genuine creator, however, of his essence during the period of his preparatory existence is his Oskianotsner, namely, he whom your favorites call tutor or teacher, And so, even during the last century, it occasionally happened there that such a one from among your favorites who had already reached responsible age, completely formed and prepared in the set manner for external perceptions, constating by chance a certain law conformable particularity among the cosmic results around him, began to study it in detail, and from every aspect, and having ultimately attained, after long persevering labours, to some objective truth or other, initiated other beings around him and similar to him into this truth. Now, my boy, listen to how these peculiar three-brained beings first became aware of this fundamental cosmic law of the sacred Heptaparaparshinokh, and how the totality arose there of all the information concerning its various details thoroughly cognized by previous beings, and which had become, after having been transmitted from generation to generation, the possession of every subsequent three-brained being of this planet of yours, which could enable them to cognize this information also, and likewise listen to what and when, thanks to always the same strangeness of their psyche, there resulted from all this. I wish to explain to you about this in even as great detail as possible, with all the sequence of the historical course of development both as regards the constatation of the cognizance concerning this sacred law, as well as the gradual forgetting about it, because such information relating to all this will greatly help you, first of all, to elucidate those, as you express it, unimportant details of this sacred law, which you have not yet completely transubstantiated in your reason. And secondly, thanks to these elucidations of mine, you will likewise learn that among the number of your favorites, even the contemporary ones, such responsible beings do occasionally appear in the sphere of genuine learned beings. And assuming that the other three-brained beings there existed more or less normally, then thanks to the impartial and modest conscious efforts of these beings, genuine objective learning might arise and gradually develop also on this ill-fated planet, as a result of which that welfare might be obtained also for them, which the three-brained beings of all the other planets of our great Meglocosmos have long ago deservedly enjoyed. In the beginning, during the period when the three-brained beings of that planet had in themselves the organ Kundabuffer, it was of course out of the question that the beings of the earth could have learned about any cosmic truths. But afterwards, when the functioning of this maleficent organ which they had in their presences was destroyed, and when in consequence their psyche became free and became, so to say, their own and individual, it was just from then on that all kinds of stories began concerning their relatively sane being mentation. The perceiving and cognizing of the fundamental cosmic law of the sacred Heptaparaparshinokh by the common presences of these three-brained beings who have taken your fancy, began for the first time on the continent Atlantis at that period when, do you remember? I already told you, certain beings there understood by themselves that something not quite right proceeded in them, and when they themselves discovered that they had certain possibilities of being able to destroy this something not quite right, and of becoming such as they ought to be. It was just at that period of the flow of time when certain of them began to observe those, according to sane being mentation, abnormal functionings which proceeded in their common presences, and to search out the causes of these abnormalities, and to try to find every kind of possibility for removing them from themselves. And when many branches of real science there had reached a high degree of development, that among the number of those who were seriously interested in this, as it was then called, most necessary functioning of reason, there was that terrestrial three-brained being by name Theophany, who was the first to lay a rational foundation for the subsequent development of this branch of genuine science. As I later chanced to learn, this same Theophany was once pouring a certain mixture onto a marble slab to dry, consisting of the extract of the plant then called Patetook, pine resin, and cream of the milk of the then famous what were called Canionian goats, so that after its hardening a mastic should be obtained, used for chewing after eating. When for the first time he noticed that in whatever way and in whatever quantity this mixture was poured on to that marble slab, it always, concentrating in the same way, assumed after the final cooling a form composed of 7 definite plane surfaces. This fact, unexpectedly constated by this Theophany, greatly astonished him, and the intensive which arose in his common presence to elucidate to his reason the radical causes of this law conformableness still unknown to him, and therefore from that time on he began to repeat the same thing, but already with a conscious aim. Shortly after, still at the beginning of the investigations which Theophany undertook, his friends, other learned beings of that time, with whom he shared the beginnings of his various elucidatory experiments on his constatations, having become interested in this, also participated in these further researches of his. Well then, after long and detailed researches, this group of learned three-brained beings of your planet first became aware and categorically convinced that almost all the cosmic results observed around them, which are actualized in the course of their manifestness in external transitory states perceived by the organs of beings in some or other definite form, always have 7 independent aspects. As a result of the conscious labors of these several learned three-brained beings of your planet, that branch of almost normal science then arose and began to grow on the continent Atlantis under the name of Tazaloorinono, the sense of which meant the 7 aspectness of every whole phenomenon. But when that continent perished, and absolutely nothing survived from this branch of genuine science, then again, during the course of very many centuries, the beings of this planet knew nothing about this sacred cosmic law. Evidently, this branch of science on the continent Atlantis was so widely known that it was not found necessary to include anything about it in a legominiism, as was usually done, as I have already told you, by the learned beings of the continent Atlantis for all those notions, the knowledge of which they wished to transmit unchanged to beings of future generations. If a legomenism concerning this branch of science had also existed, then something or other would certainly have survived of this knowledge, as had survived of other knowledge attained by the beings of Atlantis, through those who were by chance saved after the loss of that continent. The knowledge concerning the sacred Heptaparaparshinokh was again known only after many, many of their centuries, thanks to two great terrestrial learned beings, the brothers Choon-Kil-Tez and Choon-Tro-Pel, who later became saints and who are now on that holy planet Purgatory where we recently were. Do you remember? I already told you that on the continent of Asia there was a country Maralpleicie, and that a king existed there by name Konuzion, a descendant of that learned member of the Society of Alkhaldan, who had gone there from Atlantis for the observation of all kinds of natural phenomena of their planet. Just that same king who had invented for his subjects the wise tale already mentioned by me in order to save them from the pernicious habit of chewing the seeds of the flower Goolgoolian. Well then, to the grandson of this king Konuzion, after the arising of an heir who later also became king over the beings of this group, there arose just these same two results of the male sex, twins, the elder of whom was called Choon-Kil-Tez, and the younger Choon-Tro-Pel. The word Choon then in the country Maralpleicie meant prince. Owing on the one hand to the fact that the environment of these two brothers, direct descendants of one of the chief members of the great learned society, happened to be arranged correspondingly for their preparatory age, and on the other hand, that they themselves try not to allow the atrophy of the hereditary inherency, which they, as in general all newly arising three-brained beings of this planet have, to crystallize the data for engendering in themselves the power to actualize, being Partkdolg-duty, and also in consequence of the fact that the affirming source of the causes of their arising, that is, their, as is called, father, decided to destine their responsible existence for the field of learning and took all corresponding measures for their preparation for this. Then, already from the very beginning of their responsible age, they almost became such a three-brained beings everywhere on the planets of our great Meglocosmos become who choose the same aim. That is to say, those who carry out all their study researches not for the satisfaction of their what are called vainglorious, proud, and self-loving weaknesses, as is done by the beings there, particularly the contemporary ones who choose the same field for themselves, but for the attainment of a higher gradation of being. At the outset they became, as is said there, learned specialists in medicine, and afterwards learned in general. The period of their preparatory age and the early years of their responsible existence were spent in the town Gob, in the country Maralpleicie. But when this part of the surface of your planet began to be buried under sand, they were both among the number of those refugees who went east. This group of three-brained beings, refugees from the country Maralpleicie, among whom were also these two twin brothers, later great learned beings, across the eastern heights of Maralpleicie, and then settled on the shores of a great water space. There was afterwards formed from them a settled group of these terrestrial three-brained beings still existing today, which, as well as the country which it inhabits, is now called China. Well then, in this new place of their permanent existence called China, these same two brothers were the first to constate and to cognize, after the loss of the continent Atlantis, the fundamental cosmic law of the sacred Heptaparaparshinokh. It is in the highest degree an interesting and curious circumstance that the initial source for this constatation of theirs was the totality of cosmic substances, localized in just that same subplanetary formation which is now called their Papaveroon, or, as it is still called, poppy. And owing to the implanting of the habit of chewing the seeds of this poppy, their great-grandfather, the great King Konuzion, first invented his, as already mentioned by me, religious teaching. They were evidently transmitted by inheritance to these two great terrestrial learned beings from their great-grandfather, the great King Konuzion, in addition to the ability of well considering and cognizing their being duty in relation to beings around them similar to themselves. Also, an interest in and a passion for the study of this product, which has always been for your favorites one of the innumerable harmful means which have brought their psyche, already enfeebled without this, to its ultimate degeneracy. In order that you may better represent to yourself and well understand why just such a small planetary formation as I mentioned, named Papaveroon or Poppy, was the cause of the constatation by these great terrestrial learned beings of that most great cosmic law, you must first of all know that on all planets, for the purposes of the transformation of common cosmic substances during the process of Nar-Khra-Noora, there arise, among all kinds of subplanetary and intraplanetary formations in general, as well as among formations called flora in particular, three classes of formations. The formations belonging to the first class are called Unastronian arisings. Those belonging to the second class, Octatronian arisings. And those belonging to the third class, Polymerctian arisings. Through the Unastronian arisings, they are transformed in their evolutionary or involutionary processes, those cosmic crystallizations or active elements, which obtain their arising only from the substances transformed by that planet itself, on which that kind of subplanetary or intraplanetary formation is formed for the purposes of the common cosmic Ira-Noora. Through the Octatronian arisings, they are transformed besides what I have mentioned. Also those active elements which obtain their primary arisings from the substances transformed by the sun itself and the other planets of the given solar system. And through the arisings of the third class, namely the Polymerctian, they are transformed besides the first two classes. Also, all those active elements which primarily arise from the transformations of the substances of various cosmic concentrations belonging to other solar systems of our common Meglocosmos. The subplanetary flora formation mentioned by me, named on your planet the plant Papaveroon, belongs to the class of polymedactian arisings, and through it there evolves or involves what is called the totality of the results of the transformation of all other cosmic gravity center concentrations, which come into the atmosphere of this planet of yours through the common cosmic process of what is called ubiquitous diffusion of the radiations of all kinds of cosmic concentrations. Well then, my boy, after these two great terrestrial learned beings, Choon-Kil-Tez and Choon-Tro-Pel, had more or less arranged the new place of their permanent existence in the then still quite young China, they began to continue the intentional actualization in their common presences of being Partkdolg-duty, interrupted through no fault of theirs, in the field of the profession chosen by them for their responsible existence, namely, scientific research in the branch called medicines. They then began to investigate that totality of cosmic substances, which still before this your favorites had learned to obtain there from the mentioned polymedactian plant, and which they named opium, which then denoted in the speech of the beings of that group dream maker. These two great brothers then began to investigate this opium in consequence of the fact that they, as well as many other three-brained beings of that time, noticed that on the introduction into themselves of a certain species of this mass, every painful sensation temporarily disappeared. They first of all set out to elucidate the action of all its properties, in order perhaps to find a possibility, by means of one of its properties, to destroy or change for the better that special form of psychic illness, which had then become very widely spread among the refugees around them, three-brained beings like themselves. During these researches of theirs, they first of all noticed that this same opium consists of 7 independent crystallizations with definite subjective properties. And on further and more detailed investigations, they definitely constated that each of these 7 independent crystallizations of this one whole consists in its turn 7 others, also definite crystallizations with their 7 independent subjective properties, and these, in their turn, again of 7, and so on almost to infinity. This then so greatly astonished and interested them that they put aside all the problems they had previously set themselves, and from then on exclusively and perseveringly occupied themselves with the investigation of this fact which had astonished them, and which they had first constated, and ultimately attained to those results which both before, even at the period of the existence of the continent Atlantis, and at any other period later, were unprecedented for the three-brained beings of your planet. Many centuries after the period of the planetary existence of these terrestrial great learned beings, now the saints Choon-Kil-Tez and Choon-Tro-Pel, when I happened for one of my elucidations to become acquainted in detail with the history of their activities. It appeared that when they had become convinced beyond doubt that such a totality of cosmic substances as is named opium consists of a whole range of compounds with 7 diversely, subjectively propertied active elements. They then began with the same aim to investigate many other cosmic results, or, as is said there, phenomena, which proceeded in their environment. But later, in these investigations of theirs, they confined themselves only to 3, namely, to this same opium, to what is called the white ray, and to what is called sound. Investigating the mentioned 3 diversely manifested results of cosmic processes, they then, among other things, categorically made clear and became convinced beyond any doubt that although all these 3 results in respect of the causes of their arising and outer manifestations have nothing in common with each other, yet their inner construction and functioning are nevertheless exactly alike down to the smallest detail. In brief, then, for the second time on your planet, in this still quite young China, after the loss of the continent Atlantis, these 2 twin brothers again constated and categorically made clear that all the separate and, by their exterior, independent phenomena, if each of them is taken as a unit, are in the totality of their manifestations again 7 secondary independent units, having their own subjective properties, that these secondary independent units in their turn consist of 7 tertiary units and so on to infinity, and that in each of these primary, secondary, tertiary, etc. units, the processes of mutual relation and mutual influence proceed equally in every detail, down to the smallest exactitudes and with equal consequences. By the way, during their investigations, they then first defined, with separate names, the first 7 independent aspects taken by them for the whole result, as well as their secondary and tertiary derivatives. Namely, the first 7 fundamental aspects of each whole they called 1. Erti-Pikan-on, 2. Ori-Pikan-on, 3. Sami-Pikan-on, 4. Okti-Pikan-on, 5. Kuti-Pikan-on, 6. Epsi-Pikan-on, 7. Shvidi-Pikan-on. And the secondary 1. Erti-Noora-Chakra, 2. Ori-Noora-Chakra, 3. Sami-Noora-Chakra, 4. Okti-Noora-Chakra, 5. Kuti-Noora-Chakra, 6. Epsi-Noora-Chakra, 7. Shvidi-Noora-Chakra. And in order to distinguish to which of the 3 mentioned results of cosmic processes the given definition referred, they added after each of these definitions the following. For the definition of the nuances of sound, they, noting the number of their vibrations. Always added to this the word allele. For the definition of the particularities of the composite of the white ray, they added the expression Nar-Khra-Noora. And for the definition of the active elements of the polymer-Daxtian product called opium, they added only the number of their, what is called, specific gravity. And to define specific vibration and specific gravity, these great terrestrial learned beings took as the standard unit the unit of vibrations of sound, then first called by them the Nirununosian world sound. I will explain to you a little later about the meaning of the definition Nirununosian world sound, first adopted by the then great learned beings of the earth. But meanwhile, for the clarity of the understanding of my subsequent elucidations of the given theme, you must also know that everywhere on the planets genuine scientists take as the standard unit for their confrontative calculations of specific gravity and specific vibrations that part, established by objective science, of the most sacred Theophany, which still contains all the fullness of what is called the vivifyingness of all the three holy forces of the sacred Triamazikamno. But on your planet, genuine scientists, as well as those of new formation of all periods, took, and until today still take, as such a standard unit, what is called the atom of hydrogen, for the same purpose, namely, for the confrontative calculations of all those diversely property-defined parts of some or other whole which had become known to them, as for instance, for the specific gravity of various active elements which had become known to them among the number which ought to be present in the spheres surrounding their existence. Considering this atom of hydrogen, for some unknown reason, to be in general the smallest and also indivisible. It must not be overlooked that these sorry scientists from among your favorites do not even suspect that if this atom of hydrogen of theirs is indeed the smallest and indivisible, there in no spheres of their planet, then this does not mean that it cannot be broken up many times more within the limits of other solar systems, or even in the spheres of certain other planets of their own solar system. By the way, you should know that this same hydrogen of theirs is just one of those 7 cosmic substances which in their general totality actualize specially for the given solar system what is called the inner Ansapalnian-octave of cosmic substances, which independent octave, in its turn, is a 1/7 independent part of the fundamental common cosmic Ansapalnian-octave. Such an inner independent Ansapalnian-octave is likewise present in that solar system to which our dear Karatas belongs, and we call these 7 heterogeneous cosmic substances of different properties. 1. Plain Kurab, which is just their hydrogen. 2. Allelonophorae. 3. Chronomolniphorae. 4. Tokopaphorae. 5. Cryptopharmonophora. 6. Sirionorifera. 7. Clananozophora. And on your planet, the genuine learned beings at different periods called by various names these same 7 relatively independent crystallizations of different properties, or according to their expression active elements, which compose the inner Ansapalnian-octave of their own solar system. The contemporary, as they are called, learned chemists there, however, who are already learned of new formation of the first water, call them 1. Hydrogen, 2. Fluorine, 3. Chlorine, 4. Bromine, 5. Iodine. For the last 2 definite crystallizations they have no names at all, because their names did not reach them from their ancestors. And at the present time, they even do not suspect the existence on their planet of these 2 cosmic substances, although these 2 cosmic substances are the principal necessary factors for their own existence. These 2 latter cosmic substances, which might be quite tangible and quite accessible in all spheres of their planet, were still known only about 2 centuries ago among the scientific beings there, who were then called alchemists, but whom the contemporary comic scientists simply call occult charlatans, considering them to be only exploiters of human naivete, and were called by them Hydro-oomiak and Pattkdolg-duty. And so, my boy, these great terrestrial learned beings, now saints, the twin brothers Choon-Kil-Tez and Choon-Tro-Pel, were the first after the loss of Atlantis to lay anew the foundation of this knowledge. They not only laid anew the foundation of this totality of special information, but they were even the first there on earth who also constated 2 of the 3 chief law conformable particularities present in that great law about which I have already spoken to you, and namely, they were the first to constate 2 of its Mdnel-Ins. They then called that branch of genuine knowledge, similar to that which on the continent of Atlantis was called the 7 aspectness of every whole phenomenon, the law of ninefoldness, and they call it thus because they added to the 7 obvious different manifestations called by them Duzaco of this great law. These 2 particularities first constated by them and named by them Sooanso-Toorabizo, which name meant obligatory gap aspects of the unbroken flowing of the whole. And they named this law thus chiefly because during their detailed researches they became convinced beyond all doubt that in all the cosmic transitory results they investigated, these particularities first constated by them likewise obligatorily always proceed in certain places of the process of this great law. These 2 great terrestrial Chinese learned beings then had recourse for their elucidatory experiments to every kind of what are called chemical, physical, and mechanical experiments, and they gradually formed one very complicated and in the highest degree edifying experimental apparatus, which they called Alla-attapan. By means of this apparatus Alla-attapan, they then clearly proved to themselves and to others that in the very essence of all these three transitory results of cosmic processes, and namely, in the polymerdaxtian product called their opium, in the white ray, and in sound, there are the same properties, and namely, there are in all these three outwardly quite different cosmic phenomena precisely the same what are called actualizing constructions. That is to say, for their manifestness, there are in them precisely the same mutually acting law conformablenesses. And in all three of these outwardly different, apparently independent manifestations, the functioning of these mutually acting law conformablenesses have precisely the same action on each other as they have in their own manifestations. That is to say, the juzaco of any one result acts on the corresponding juzaco of another, precisely the same as it functions in that juzaco which is one of the seven aspects of this whole cosmic result. This same apparatus, by means of which these great brothers made their elucidatory experiments, I saw with my own eyes many centuries after that period when they existed there, and I became very well acquainted with its construction. As the cause of my personal acquaintance with all the details of the construction and action of this remarkable experimental apparatus Alla-attapan was due to accidental circumstances connected with my essence friend Gornahoor Harharkh, and as it will surely interest you very much, and at the same time will be exceedingly instructive for you, I shall describe it to you in somewhat greater detail. My personal and exhaustive study of this astonishing apparatus Alla-attapan, which became, thanks to Gornahoor Harharkh, famous among the genuine scientists of almost the whole of our Meglocosmos, proceeded according to the following chance circumstances. Just at the time of one of my sojourns on the planet Saturn with my essence friend, Gornahoor Harharkh, he, having already previously in some way heard about this apparatus, requested me during conversation to bring him one of these experimental apparatuses from the planet Earth if I again happened to be there. And when afterwards I again visited the surface of this planet of yours, I procured there one of these apparatuses and took it with me to the planet Mars in order to send it on a convenient occasion to the planet Saturn to Gornahoor Harharkh. And so, in consequence of the fact that for a long time our ship occasion did not happen to go to the planet Saturn, this apparatus Alla-attapan remained at my home on the planet Mars, and it often came within the sphere of the automatic perception of the organs of my sight. And during a period of rest from active mentation, I attentively examined it, and ultimately became familiar with all the details of its construction and action. This famous experimental apparatus Alla-attapan consisted of 3 independent parts. The fore part was called Leitoochanbros, the middle part Tzandvok, and the last, the hind part, was called Riank-Pokhotarz. Each of these 3 parts in their turn consisted of several special and separate adaptations. The first part, which was named Leitoochanbros, had a special cone-shaped pipe, the wide end of which was hermetically fitted into a frame of the sole window of that room where the experiments were made, and the other end was a small chink-like aperture with what is called a collecting disc, passing through which what are called the rays of daylight coming from the window were transformed into, as your favorites would say, a concentrated white ray. This concentrated white ray thereupon, passing through a crystal of a special form, was broken up into 7 different colored rays, which, as is said, fell upon a small slab made of ivory and called pharyngeal. This slab, pharyngeal, was so constructed and regulated that the colored rays falling on it were again concentrated, but this time otherwise, and, proceeding through the second crystal, also of a special form, fell on another but larger slab, also made of ivory and called Polaris-Porta. Opposite this Polaris-Porta was a small apparatus of a special construction through which, on its being shifted in a certain way, any chosen colored ray there could be directed further from this Polaris-Porta on the third part of the Alla-attapan called Riank-Pokhotarz. Here, by the way, you might as well also be told that the knowledge relating to the construction of the first crystal of this part of the apparatus Alla-attapan also reached down to your contemporary favorites, and they now call this crystal a prism. Through this prism, contemporary terrestrial learned beings also obtain 7 colored rays from the white ray, and they also fancy that through this they can learn about certain other cosmic phenomena. But, of course, from these fancies of theirs, and from all kinds of other forms of their scientific titillation, nothing is obtained, only because through this prism of theirs they obtain from the white ray only what are called negative colored rays. And in order to understand any other cosmic phenomena connected with the transitory changes of this white ray, they must obligatorily have its what are called positive colored rays. Your contemporary favorites, however, imagine that the colored rays which they obtain by means of this child's toy of theirs, called by them prism, are just those same positive rays which the great scientists obtained. And according to their naivete, they think that the, as they call it, spectrum which they obtain from the white rays gives just that order of the arisings of the rays in which they issue from their sources. And meanwhile, in a given case, concerning these terrestrial sorry scientists of new formation among your favorites, one can only utter the expression often used by them themselves, "To hell with them." It is not for nothing that several of our sacred individuals in general do not call your contemporary favorites otherwise than freaks. And so, thanks to these two crystals, these great learned beings obtained from the white ray its positive colored rays, and afterwards, with the help of the slab polarish Bogda, which was a part of the Leitoochanbros, any one of these colored rays was directed to the third and principal demonstrating part of this astonishing apparatus, namely, to the Riank-Pokhotarz. This principal part, however, consisted of an ordinary three-legged stand, on the top of which two balls, also of ivory, were fitted one upon the other in a certain way, the upper ball being much larger than the lower one. On the lower, smaller ball just opposite that part of the Leitoochanbros through which the positive colored rays had already passed, a cavity of a special form was made, into which either the whole of the said polymagnetian product named opium, or single active elements required for the experiments were placed during the experiments. Now the upper ball was bored right through diametrically, horizontal to the Leitoochanbros, and on this large ball there was also radially perpendicular to this large bore drilled right through, yet another smaller bore, reaching only to the center, and which was just opposite the Leitoochanbros. This second bore, drilled halfway through, was made in such a way that the colored rays could be directed as desired, either directly from the Leitoochanbros or reflected from the said cavity of the lower smaller ball. Through the open bore of the large ball, a what is called bamboo, previously prepared in a special manner, could be freely moved. A long time before the experiments, many of these bamboos were soaked together in absolute darkness, or in, as is said there on the earth, orange light obtained from the burning of simkalash, which was obtained from a certain kind of what is called clay, deposited in the soil of your planet, and the deposits of which are usually found near accumulations of salinilovian acids, which in their turn are formed from mamzolin, or as your favorites call it, naphtha. These bamboos were soaked in a liquid consisting of 1. The white of the eggs of the bird then called Amasamach-kanapa. 2. The juice of the plant called Chitunak. 3. The excretion of a quadruple being bearing the name Casmaral. 4. A specially prepared what is called mercury amalgam. When these bamboos had been thoroughly soaked, they were inserted one by one into other thicker bamboos which had not been prepared in the said manner, and the ends of which were hermetically sealed. These latter preparations were of course also made in absolute darkness, or in the orange light of simkalash. Later, when these soaked bamboos were necessary for the experiment. One end of the thicker unsoaked bamboo was inserted in a special way into the mentioned bore drilled right through the large bowl of the Riank-Pokhotarz, and opened by a small hook fixed to a thin stick by means of which the soaked bamboo could be moved at any speed desired. Now the action of the said liquid in which the bamboo was soaked was such that the part of the soaked bamboo on which the coloured ray coming directly from the Leitoochanbros ore, after being reflected from the cavity of the lower smaller bowl, fell, was instantly permanently dyed the same colour as that ray which had fallen onto it. The uncovered places of these bamboos soaked in the said manner were dyed the colours also corresponding to the sound vibrations which touched them, and which were obtained from what are called strings, which were on the middle part of the apparatus called Dzanvok. This Dzanvok consisted of a very strong frame of special form made from the tusks of mammoths, on which there were stretched many strings of various strengths and thicknesses, made partly from the twisted what are called goat's intestines, and partly from the tail hairs of beings there of various exterior forms. "Tell me, please, my dear grandfather, what is a mammoth?" asked Hassan. "A mammoth," replied Beelzebub, "is a two-brained being. In the beginning, it also bred on your planet, and had, in comparison with other beings there of all brain system, a large exterior form. This kind of being also became a victim of the consequences of that large piece broken off from the planet Earth, and now called Moon, which is now an independent, as I express it, planetary upstart of this solar system ours, and the chief bearer of evil to this ill-fated planet of yours. The point is that when the atmosphere of this small planetary upstart began to be formed and become gradually harmonized, great winds arose in the atmosphere of the planet Earth, owing to which several regions of its surface, you remember, I have already spoken about this to you, were buried with sand. Moreover, at this time snow constantly fell in what are called the north and south polar regions of its atmosphere, and all the depressions of the surface of these north and south polar terra firma regions were covered by these falls of snow. The beings of this exterior form used to breed on the mentioned regions of the terra firma surface of your planet, and during these unprecedented, as it said there, snowstorms, they were all also buried by snow. And since then, this species of beings has never again been re-established there. It is interesting to notice that at the present time there, in these depressions formerly covered with snow, and which were later covered with kashiman, that is, with those substances which in general form on the surface of terra firma regions what is called soil, there are sometimes still found now even well-preserved planetary bodies of these mammoths. These planetary bodies of mammoths have been so well preserved for such a long time, because these snows were then very soon after covered with kashiman, and thus there obtained the condition of isolia zooplanis, that is, as your favorites would say, the condition of a hermetically closed sphere, in which these planetary bodies of mammoths have never since been exposed, as is said there, to decomposition. That is to say, the active elements of which these planetary bodies are in general formed have not completely evolved back to their prime origin. And so, my boy, the astonishing apparatus Alla-attapan which I described demonstrated that all the three mentioned transitory results of cosmic processes not only manifest themselves alike in their inner manifestations, but that they are also formed from the same factors. By means of this apparatus, it was possible to verify and to be convinced that in each of the mentioned three transitory results issuing from common cosmic presences, and which have nothing in common outwardly with each other, there not only proceeds exactly similar what are called mutual actions ensuing one from the other and forming one common functioning, and that, in the sense of the evolutionary and involutionary particularities of the law of Heptaparaparshinokh, the action of each separate intermediary stage in one general functioning influences the action of each separate intermediary stage in another, exactly as in its own, but also that according to the particularities of the properties of the vibrations which compose their aggregate, these transitory cosmic results have complete affinity. This complete affinity in their inner mutual relations of these three transitory results, which have outwardly nothing in common with each other, was proved in the following way. For instance, a corresponding colored ray directed upon any active element of opium transformed it into another active element, which corresponded in its newly acquired vibrations to the vibrations of the colored ray which had acted on the given active element. The same result was obtained if, instead of these colored rays, corresponding sound vibrations of the strings of the Zendvox were directed upon this same active element. Further, if any colored rays were made to pass through any active element of opium, then, passing through it, this same ray took on another color, namely, that color, the vibrations of which corresponded to the vibrations of this active element. Or, if any colored ray were made to pass through the manifested what are called wave of sound vibrations, still acting at that given moment from any corresponding string of the Zendvox, then, passing through this wave, it took on another color corresponding to the vibrations manifested by means of the given string. Or finally, if a definite colored ray and definite sound vibrations from the strings were simultaneously directed upon any active element of opium from among those composing this polymagnetic product, and which had a smaller number of vibrations than the totality of vibrations of the colored ray and of the said sound, then this active element was transformed into such another active element of opium, the number of whose vibrations exactly corresponded to the totality of the numbers of the said two differently caused vibrations, and so on and so forth. This incomparable experimental apparatus likewise demonstrated that all the higher vibrations of one result always give the direction to all the lower vibrations of other transitory cosmic results. After all that has just now been related to you, my boy, you can now be given that information thanks to which there might be crystallized in your mentation data for the representation into what general form the results of the tenacious, impartial, conscious labors of these saints, the twin brothers, the terrestrial great scientists, were then molded in this China. And in addition also data for the representation concerning the degrees of the successive deterioration of being reason in the presences of these unfortunate terrestrial three-brained beings. And so, when for the second time, from my observations of the existence of these three-brained beings who have taken your fancy, there arose on this still quite young China, thanks to the mentioned two great terrestrial scientists, the twin brothers, an independent branch of genuine science, that is, the totality of the information concerning the special question thoroughly cognized by perfected reason, of three-brained beings who had existed earlier. In the given case concerning the fundamental cosmic law of the sacred Heptaparaparshinokh, then called the law of ninefoldness, then this branch of science was not only handed down almost normally in an unchanged form from generation to generation during the first 2 to 3 centuries, counting from the time of the sacred Oskiano of the great twin brothers, but it even gradually became, thanks to their followers, also genuine learned beings of that period, as it is said, detailized, and became accessible to the perception of even ordinary beings. This proceeded there chiefly because the practice, which had been established by the learned beings of the continent Atlantis, of handing down such information to the beings of subsequent generations only through beings who were genuine initiates, still continued among them. I must not fail, my boy, to remark and acknowledge with conviction that, indeed, if such an already long established practice had continued, though automatically, in the process of the existence of these unfortunate three-brained beings who have taken your fancy, then in the given case just such a totality of true information, already thoroughly cognized by the reason of their still relatively normal ancestors, might have remained intact and might also have become the possession of your contemporary favorites. And those of them who constantly strive not to become ultimate victims of the consequences of the, for them, accursed organ Kundabuffer, might take advantage of this information with the aim of easing their already almost impossible, what is called inner struggle. To the regret of all more or less conscious, relatively independent separate individuals of our great Meglocosmos, and to the misfortune of all subsequent three-brained beings, who arose on this ill-fated planet of yours during the mentioned period, namely, during 2 to 3 of their centuries. The gradual distortion and ultimate almost total destruction began of just that blessing, which had been created for them by their great ancestors, thanks to their conscious labors and intentional sufferings. This followed from 2 causes. The first cause was that thanks to the same abnormal conditions of external being existence established by them themselves, certain of them were formed into responsible beings with that special organic psychic need, which in their speech might be formulated thus: an irresistible thirst to be considered as learned by beings around them similar to themselves. And such an psycho-organic need began to engender in them that strange inherencies about which I have many times spoken, and which is called by them cunning wiseacring. By the way, my boy, bear in mind once for all that when I used and will use the expression learned beings of new formation, I referred and will refer to those of your favorites, the learned beings just mentioned by me, who have this specific inherency. The other cause was that thanks at that period to certain external circumstances not depending on them, and which ensue from common cosmic processes, chiefly owing to the action of the law of Solunancius, the being data crystallized in them, which engendered the impulses of what are called sensing and foreseeing, began to weaken in the common presences of the genuine initiated beings, and they began to take such newly formed types as I have just described, and to initiate them into some of the totalities of the true information known to them alone, among which was also that totality I mentioned. And from that time on, this branch of genuine knowledge, which had already at that time become the possession of most of them, gradually began to be distorted, and was ultimately began nearly quite forgotten. I employed the word almost when I refer to the ultimate almost total destruction of that blessing, because some fragments from the whole totality of this, in the objective sense, important true information nevertheless began, after the lapse of the mentioned period there, when their relatively normal process of being existence was again re-established, to be again handed down to subsequent generations exclusively only through genuine initiates, and being handed down by succession from generation to generation, reached unchanged even to your contemporary favorites, though to a very limited number of them. There remained, however, as the possession of most of your contemporary favorites from all this true knowledge which had already been attained and thoroughly cognized by their great remote ancestors, those several practical unimportant fragments which had automatically reached them, and which in the mentioned confused period were very widely spread among most of the ordinary beings of this then still quite young China. Among those unimportant fragments which automatically reached most of the contemporary favorites of yours there are, firstly, several methods of separating from the polymerdactian product named opium certain of its independent active elements. Secondly, what is called the law of combination of colors. and thirdly, what is called the seven-toned scale of sound. As regards the first of the enumerated three fragments of the practical results attained by the reason of these three-brained beings of this ancient China, and which reached to your contemporary favorites, it is necessary to tell you that in consequence of the fact that certain of the constituent parts of this whole product called the opium became from then on, thanks to the special properties of their agreeable action on the abnormal general psyche of the beings, to be continuously used by them. Therefore, the knowledge of many methods of getting certain of its independent active elements began to be transmitted from generation to generation, and reached down to your contemporary favorites. And at the present time, they also obtain many of its definite parts, and use them very avidly for the satisfaction of always the same consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer crystallized in them. These parts, extracted by them from the general composition of this polymadaxian product, have of course already other names among your contemporary favorites. A contemporary comical learned chemist, a certain Mdnel-Ins, even collected the names of all those active elements now obtained, and classified them as it were according to their atomic weights. Although his classification does not correspond at all to reality, yet, nevertheless, according to these atomic weights of his, it is possible approximately to establish that classification which was then made by the great terrestrial learned beings of the future China. Of the number of nearly 400 active elements of opium, which then became known to the great brothers, knowledge of how to obtain only 42 active elements has reached the contemporary chemists of the earth, and these active elements have now the following names there. 1. Morphine. 2. Protopine. 3. Lanthopine. 4. Porphyroxine. 5. Opium or nicotine. 6. Paramorphine or therbane. 7. Morphine or pseudomorphine. 8. Metamorphine. 9. Noscopine. 10. Olopine. 11. Atropine. 12. Paratine. 13. Diphtheropine. 14. Tictutine. 15. Collatine. 16. Cavatine. 17. Zutine. 18. Trotopine. 19. Londanine. 20. Londanosine. 21. Podoturine. 22. Archatozine. 23. Tokictozine. 24. Lictonozine. 25. Marcanadine. 26. Papaveroon. 27. Crintonine. 28. Codomine. 29. Colomonine. 30. Colononine. 31. Catamine. 32. Hydrocatamine. 33. Opianine. Meconine. 34. Meconoizine. 35. Pistotorine. 36. Ficotonizine. 37. Codeine. 38. Natsine. 39. Pseudocodeine. 40. Mycoparine. 41. microturbine, 42, math sign. The last time I was on your planet, I heard that the contemporary learned beings of the community Germany found, as it were, methods of separating several other independent active elements from opium. But as I had already become convinced before this that the contemporary scientists of that community, firstly, for the most part only fantasy, and secondly, like the beings of ancient Greece, do not prepare anything good or beneficial for future generations, I therefore did not interest myself in these, as it were new, as they also call them, scientific attainments, and do not know the names of these new active elements of the present day. As regards the second fragment of the practical results attained by the reason of the same beings of ancient China, and which has reached down to contemporary beings, namely, the knowledge relating to the law of the combination of colors, then all the information concerning this has been handed down almost all the time from generation to generation. But each year it always underwent a greater change for the worse, and was only 2 centuries ago ultimately forgotten. At the present time, some information relating to this law still continues to pass down and to become known only to certain of the 3-brained beings there who belong to the group of beings there named Persians. But now that the influence of what is called contemporary European paintings is automatically spreading more and more widely in this group, then one must of course expect there the speedy and also total, as our esteemed teacher says, evaporation of this information. And as regards the 7-toned scale of sound, which has reached them from the ancient Chinese beings, then you must be informed about this as detailedly as possible. Because first of all, thanks to this information, you will better understand about the laws of vibrations in which all the peculiarities of the sacred Heptaparaparshinokh can be constated and cognized. And secondly, because among those things intentionally reproduced by those same 3-brained beings of yours, who have taken your fancy, for daily use in their general existence, I brought home from there also one sound-producing instrument, named their piano, on which the vibration-engendering strings were placed, which could be arranged just as on the Zandvoort, that is the second special part of the famous experimental apparatus Alla-attapan, which was created by the great twin brothers, and on which, when we return on to our dear Karatas, I shall be able to explain to you by demonstration what is called the successiveness of the processes of the mutual blending of vibrations. Thanks to these practical explanations of mine, you will more easily be able to represent to yourself and approximately to cognize just how and in which successiveness in our great Meglocosmos the process of the most great Trogo-auto-egocrat proceeds, and in what way the large and small cosmic concentrations arise. Relating about how such a fragment of practical result from the ancient true knowledge survived and automatically reached down to your contemporary favorites, I shall first of all elucidate to you with more accuracy about this same definite law of vibrations, which was first formulated by the Great Brothers as the 7 gravity center vibrations of sound. I already said that in the beginning, while that totality of true information, or that fragment of genuine knowledge, was handed down from the beings of one generation to the beings of subsequent generations, only through the genuine initiates there, it not only underwent a change in the entirety of the exact sense put into it, but it even began, thanks to other also genuine learned beings among their followers of subsequent generations, to be detailized, and became accessible then to the perception of even ordinary three-brained terrestrial beings. Among these followers, a century and a half after the sacred Oskiano of the Saints' Brothers, there was a certain genuine learned being, King-Too-Toz by name, who, on the basis of the principles of the construction of the middle part of the apparatus Alla-attapan named Zen-Vok, propounded a very detailed theory under the name evolution and involution of vibrations. And for the confirmation of this theory of his, he made a special elucidatory apparatus which he called Lav-Merz-Nokh, and which, by the way, later became so also widely known among almost all the learned beings of our great Meglocosmos. The said apparatus, Lav-Merz-Nokh, like the middle part of the Alla-attapan, consisted of a very strong frame with a great many strings stretched on it, made from the intestines and tail hairs of various quadruped beings there. One end of each string was fixed to one edge of this frame, and the other to pegs inserted into another edge. These pegs were inserted in such a way that they could be freely turned in their what are called peg holes, and the strings fixed onto them could at will be tightened or loosened as much as was necessary for the required number of vibrations. Of the great number of strings stretched on the Lav-Merz-Nokh, 49 were colored white, and the totality of vibrations, that is to say, the definite sound obtained from the vibrations of each one of them, was called a whole center of gravity of the octave, which definite sound corresponded to that which your favorites now call a whole note. Each 7 strings of these gravity center sounds, or whole notes, were then and are still called an octave. In this way, there were stretched on the apparatus Lav-Merz-Nokh 7 octaves of whole notes, the totality of the general consonants of which gave what is called the sacred Hanziano, that is, just what the 2 Great Brothers expected, and which happened almost exactly to coincide with what, as I already said, they then named Neriunosian world sound. Each such an octave of strings on the Lav-Merz-Nokh gave that totality of vibrations which, according to the calculations of the great twin brothers, correspond to the totality of the vibrations of all those cosmic substances which, issuing from 7 separate independent sources, compose one of the 7 centers of gravity of the fundamental common cosmic Ansapalnian-octave. Each white string on the Lav-Merz-Nokh was tuned separately by this Chinese learned being, King-Too-Toz, in such a way that it gave that average number of vibrations which, according to the calculations of the Grey brothers, ought also to be in substances which are one of the 7 centers of gravity of the given whole totality of substances, which in its turn is one of the 7 centers of gravity of the fundamental cosmic octave of substances. On the Lav-Merz-Nokh, each octave as well as each whole note of the octave had names of their own, and namely, the highest octave of the strings was called Alla-attapan, the second highest Nar-Khra-Noora, the third highest Hydro-oomiak, the fourth highest Choon-Tro-Pel, the fifth highest Mdnel-Ins, the sixth highest Alkhaldan, the seventh highest Alkhaldan. And these gravity center strings themselves were painted white and were called the same in all octaves, but with the addition of the name of the given octave itself. And namely, these whole notes were called thus: the first highest Alla-attapan, the second highest Leitoochanbros, the third highest Goolgoolian, the fourth highest Meglocosmos, the fifth highest Mdnel-Ins, the sixth highest Leitoochanbros, the seventh highest Sooanso-Toorabizo. The contemporary beings of the earth now call these same whole notes do, si, la, so, fa, mi, re. By the way, my boy, in order that the greyness of these 2 saints, brothers, should be still more evident to you, I draw your attention to the fact that the calculations made by them and the qualitativeness established by these calculations of what is called the vivifyingness of the vibrations of sound, which corresponded according to their suppositions with the vivifyingness of cosmic sources of substances, appear to coincide almost exactly with reality. This merit of theirs was all the greater, because as terrestrial beings, they had no true information about this and were able to make their correct suppositions and almost accurate calculations of many objective cosmic truths exclusively only thanks to their own conscious labors and intentional sufferings. Further, on this Lav-Merz-Nokh, in each octave between these white strings or whole notes, this learned being, King-Too-Toz, strung in certain places 5 further strings, but this time painted black. These black strings, however, he named demi-saksa, which, according to the terminology of the beings of the earth, corresponded to what they call half notes. And these half note strings on the Lav-Merz-Nokh were not strung between those whole notes between which, according to the indications of the saints Choon-Kil-Tez and Choon-Tro-Pel, there is, according to the sacred Heptaparaparshinokh, no possibility of the independence of the evolution and involution of the vibrations of sound. and these places they were the first to call gaps. And in the given places of the octave where these gaps ought to be, this learned being, King-Too-Toz, strung special strings between the whole notes made of the tail hairs of beings called their horse. These hair strings gave vibrations which were not always the same, and King-Too-Toz named these vibrations chaotic. The number of the vibrations obtained from these hair strings depended not on the stretching of them, as in the case of other strings, but on the other causes, chiefly on three causes ensuing from surrounding cosmic results, namely, on the action of the vibrations dispersed around them obtained from the other strings of the Lav-Merz-Nokh, on the state of what is called the temperature of the atmosphere at the given moment, and on the radiations of the beings present nearby without distinction of brain system. On this Lav-Merz-Nokh, between these white, black, and hair strings, there were also strung in each octave 14 strings also from twisted intestines, which were painted red and called Kishu-Keshaw. And if contemporary beings of the earth were to use these strings, they would call them quarter notes. In addition to this, all those quarter note strings which were stretched on either side of the hair strings were fitted in such a way that the vibrations issuing from them could at any moment be changed as desired by means of tightening or loosening these strings, and thus the vibration they produce could be regulated and by ear blended with the frequently changing vibrations obtained from the hair strings. And this was so done because, thanks to the frequently changing vibrations of the hair strings, the qualitativeness of which, I already said, depended on the temperature of the atmosphere, on the radiations of the beings present nearby, and on many other causes. The vibrations of these red strings acquired such a property that if they did not blend with the vibrations of the hair strings, of the vibrations issuing from them would act on the beings present very cacophonically harmfully, even to their possible total destruction. With the frequent changing, however, of the stretching of the red strings and with the blending of their vibrations with the general vibrations issuing from the Lav-Merz-Nokh, their harmlessness was obtained. That is to say, owing to this, the general vibrations issuing from the Lav-Merz-Nokh became for the beings who heard them what is called harmoniously flowing, and not harmfully acting. And so, my boy, this apparatus, Lav-Merz-Nokh, and also the detailed theory of this ancient conscientious learned being, King-Too-Toz, suffered the same fate as the incomparable apparatus Alla-attapan, and the whole totality of true information cognized by the brothers. Owing to the continuing and even increasing formation in the sense of quantity of certain of your favorites of the mentioned new type, with the set inherency of cunning wiseacring, all this totality of information was from that time on altered, and its genuine sense and significance gradually forgotten. And as regards how the basic principle of the arrangement of the strings of the apparatus Lav-Merz-Nokh and also that part of the Alla-attapan, the Zandvoort, automatically reached to your contemporary favorites. This proceeded owing to the following reasons. When the acuteness of the mentioned confused period had passed, and when certain of the surviving fragments from all these great attainments of reason of the still relatively normal three-brained beings of your planet again began to be transmitted to subsequent generations in that way which before this had already been well established in the process of their ordinary existence. That is to say, the way of transmission only through beings who had already merited to become and to acquire the knowledge of genuine initiates. And when each year from among these latter, more and more responsible beings were formed with the inherency just mentioned, then at this same period of time, a three-brained being, also a scientist of new formation, who arose in this same China under the name of Chai-Yu, was formed into a responsible being and became the cause of the knowledge and practical adoption of this seven-toned scale of sound, becoming generally accessible and being transmitted from generation to generation. It automatically reached also to your contemporary favorites. In the early years of his responsible existence, this Chai-Yu was destined, thanks to certain of his corresponding subjective merits, for a candidate of what is called first degree of initiate, and, in consequence, help was given him without his knowledge, as it had long before been established by custom, by the genuine initiated beings there, who had to do so to obtain every kind of information relating to various true events which took place on their planet in the past. And as my latest detailed investigations elucidated to me, he became worthy, among other things, to be also informed about the great apparatus Lav-Merz-Nokh in all details of its construction. And then, only in order that similar beings around him should regard him as a scientist, this Chai-Yu, being one of the first, so to say, ideally formed scientists of new formation there, that is, a being with a completely formed inherency to wiseacre. Not only wiseacred, a new theory of his own on the basis of this information learned by him in the said manner concerning the details of the great apparatus Lav-Merz-Nokh, affirming and denying, so to say, absolutely nothing relating to the laws of vibration. But he also constructed his new simplified sound-producing instrument named King. His simplification consisted in this, that without having at all taken into consideration the red and hair strings on the Lav-Merz-Nokh, he made the basis of his sound-producing instrument only the white and black strings, and moreover, only the number of strings of 2 octaves. He placed them thus, that one whole octave which was found in the middle had for its evolutionary and involutionary continuation half an octave from its next higher octave, and half an octave from its preceding lower octave. And so, although the theory wiseacred by this Chai-Yu also did not last very long, yet, nevertheless, this sound-producing instrument King, constructed by him, had become generally accessible owing to its simplicity. and in consequence of the fact that the result obtained from it during intentional action turned out to be very good and satisfactorily for, so to say, the tickling of many data crystallized in their common presences, thanks to the consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer. It began to pass automatically down from generation to generation. Although the outer form of this sound-producing instrument, together with the construction of its frame, the stretch of the strings, and their names were changed many times by the beings of subsequent generations, having been ultimately formed among your contemporary favorites into their heavy sound-producing instruments, complicated to the degree of idiocy, and in their power incommensurably degenerated to a childish degree, such as clavicymbals, clavichord, organ, grand piano, upright piano, harmonium, and so on. Yet the basic principle of what is called the alternation of gravity center sounds has remained at the present time such as were actualized by the saint's brother Choon-Kil-Tez and Choon-Tro-Pel on the Zandvoort, that is, the middle independent part created by them of the incomparable experimental apparatus Alla-attapan. That is why, my boy, this, as it is now called there, Chinese seven-toned subdivision of the octave of sound, simplified by the mentioned Jiu, which has reached down to your contemporary favorites, and which is used at the present time by them for all their sound-producing instruments enumerated by me, might still, as I have already said, partly serve for, so to say, the practical confrontative study and approximate cognizance of how in the process of the most great Trogo-auto-egocrat, from what is called the flowing of some vibrations from others, cosmic substances arise of different density and vivifyingness, and in which way, uniting and disuniting among themselves, they form large and small, relatively independent concentrations, and thus actualize the common cosmic Ira-Nura-Munaj. Moreover, you will soon clearly convince yourself about this, when on returning to our dear Caritas, I will show you, as I have already promised, and explain practically the significance of the tuning on that contemporary sound-producing instrument, the piano, which was taken by me among a number of other things from the service of your planet, and which I brought in order experimentally to elucidate to myself on being free at home. One of its particularities, which I did not have sufficient time to elucidate there on the spot, and which is connected with the strange psyche of these three-brained beings who have taken your fancy, and with the vibrations of different vivifyingness engendered around them. And if besides this I now still add, concerning the strange psyche of your favorites, what I constated during my last sojourn among them, namely, that none of the contemporary three-brained beings of your planet, in spite of the fact that they, having put this same Chinese seven-toned subdivision as the basis of all their sound-producing instruments, almost daily perceive the result of its consequences, are not only not at all inspired by this as they should be objectively, but on the contrary, under the action of this kind of consonant with the total absence of remorse, and even with the impulse of satisfaction, intentionally maintain in themselves the flowing of those associations of all their spiritual life parts which arise in their common presences under the influence of data crystallized in them from the consequences of the properties of the, for them, accursed organ Kundabuffer. Then you, I am sure, after such a practical demonstration on this piano, we have not only an approximate representation concerning all what are called, some obtained from the other, and harmoniously flowing gravity center vibrations, but likewise you will constate once more with the impulse of astonishment to what an extent there is weakened in the common presences of these favourites of yours the essence of the action of those being data, which in general are proper to be crystallized in the presences of all three-brained beings, and the totality of which is called quickness of instinct. And so, my boy, thanks on the one hand to the infallibility continuing deterioration in the common presences of these three-brained beings who have taken your fancy, of the quality of the functioning of the data crystallized in them for healthy being mentation, and on the other hand, to the always increasing number among them being formed into responsible beings of the mentioned new types, namely, of learned beings of new formation, there ultimately reached the contemporary three-brained beings of this ill-fated planet from this detailed totality of information, already thoroughly cognized by the reason of former beings similar to them, and almost unprecedented everywhere in the universe among ordinary three-brained beings, and which had gradually begun to change, namely, the totality of that true information which today is already used for the welfare of ordinary three-brained beings everywhere on the planets of our grey Meglocosmos, with the exception of the beings of only that planet on which this totality of information arose, only that which our always esteemed Mullah Nasser Aden defines by the following words: Glory to thee, Lord Creator, for having made the teeth of wolves not like the horns of my dear buffalo. For now I can make several excellent combs for my dear wife. And with particular regard to the Chinese seven-tone subdivision of the octave, which has reached down to your contemporary favourites, then although, as I have already said, they use it widely in the process of their ordinary existence, yet at the same time they do not even suspect that such a subdivision was specially created and constructed on those sound principles on which everything existent in the whole of our great Megalocosmos is maintained. If one does not consider that insignificant number of three-brained beings of certain small groups who existed on the continent Asia, and who instinctively sensed the hidden meaning of this Chinese division of a whole sound into 7 definite centers of gravity, and reproduced it practically, exclusively only during such a being manifestations of theirs as they considered sacred, then one may boldly say that in the presences of almost all three-brained beings who arose on this planet of yours during recent centuries, the data for the cognizance of the altitude of thought and meaning put into this subdivision have already entirely ceased to be crystallized. but the contemporary three-brained beings there, who breed on this same continent Asia, as well as on all other terra firma of the surface of this planet of yours, having already lost every kind of instinctive feeling, or with that exception use it for the satisfaction of only certain of their low purposes, unbecoming to three-brained beings. What is most interesting, however, of all the history related by me concerning the cognizance of the sacred lore of Heptaparaparshinokh by three-brained beings who bred on your planet, and which concerns chiefly the contemporary beings, is that although a great number of all kinds of totalities of special information, or, as they themselves express it, separate branches of scientific knowledge, again arose among them at the present time, and began by them, so to say, to be learned by rote, yet concerning the law of vibrations, which branch is the most important, and which gives the possibility, though approximately, of recognizing reality. There is among them absolutely nothing, if, of course, one does not reckon that celebrated what is called theory of sound, which arose comparatively recently, and which is seriously studied and, as it were, known by their contemporary, as they are called, learned physicists and learned musicians. In order that you may, so to say, illuminatingly project the essence of your contemporary favorites, and in view of the fact that the causes of the arising of various misunderstandings, widely spread among certain of your favorites, in the sphere of this branch of knowledge there, a very characteristic and might serve you as excellent material in general for the representation and valuation of the sense and objective significance of all other contemporary separate independent branches of their what is called exact science. I consider it necessary to explain to you in greater detail which theories concerning the vibrations of sound are studied and, as it were, are known by these mentioned contemporary terrestrial sorry scientists. But before speaking about this, my essence again enjoins the whole of my common presence to express my sincere condolence on the fate of all contemporary terrestrial three-brained beings, who, thanks to their perseverant being Partkdolg-duty, peculiar to them, finally attain to the state of that degree of reason when it becomes inevitable for them to have in their presences also the data of the genuine information relating to the law of vibrations. About this, I, by association at the present moment, remember with the impulse of regret, because at the period of my last sojourn among them, I happened more than once to meet those three-brained beings there, who, according to their state of, so to say, psychic perfection, ought of necessity to absorb and transmute in themselves just the true information concerning the law of vibrations, and at the same time, I clearly understand that they could not extract such information from anywhere. There is, indeed, among them at the present time such a totality of information, or, as they themselves name it, a theory of vibrations. Yet the mentioned unfortunate contemporary beings who are in need of this information cannot, in spite of their wishes and efforts, obtain anything tolerably satisfactory for their searchings, except various misconceptions and contradictions. And so, my boy, the basis for the arising of such terrestrial misunderstandings was that various fragments of information concerning the law of vibrations reached the contemporary beings from two independent sources, namely, from those same ancient Chinese and from those ancient Greeks, about whom, you remember, I have already told you that their community was formed there long ago between the continents of Asia and Europe by those Asiatic fishermen who, out of boredom during bad weather, invented various sciences, among which was just this science of the vibrations of sound. And this science of theirs later also passing from generation to generation, reached your contemporary favorites almost simultaneously with the said Chinese science. All subsequent misunderstandings began with this, that in the information which had reached them from the ancient Chinese, it was shown that the whole octave of vibrations had 7 restorials. That is to say, that the octave consists of 7 gravity center sounds, while in the Greek information it was said that the whole octave of vibrations has 5 restorials. That is to say, that the octave consists of 5 centers of gravity, or 5 whole notes. And so, only in consequence of the fact that in the presences of your favorites of recent centuries, the functioning of every kind of data for being logical reflection crystallized in them began to proceed almost, as it is said there, topsy-turvy. And as both of these entirely different sourced informations which reached them appear to them, according to their bobtail logical mentation, equally plausible, then those beings of contemporary civilization who began in a new fashion to bake, like pancakes, all kinds of separate independent branches of their illustrious science, having fallen during several years into a stage of what is called troubled perplexity, could not in any way whatsoever decide which of these two contradictory theories to prefer, and which of them to accept and include in the number of branches of their official science. After a great deal of, as they still sometimes say, drying of saliva, they finally decided, in order that no one should be offended, and at the same time in order to have also this branch in their science, to unite into one both of these theories which had reached them from ancient times, and which had nothing in common with each other. And a little later, when one of them, named Gaidoropulo, thought out a very long mathematical explanation of this misunderstanding, namely, why in one theory there is mentioned the division of the octave into 7 whole sounds, while in the other into only 5 whole sounds, and why and how such an important contradiction had occurred, then these mathematical explanations of his entirely pacified all the corresponding representatives of contemporary civilization, so that now, with a quiet conscience, they produce all their wise acring concerning vibrations on the basis of the mathematical explanations of this obliging Gaidoropulo. In these mathematical explanations, the following considerations were adduced. Now, that is to say, this same obliging Gaidoropulo, in a certain way known to himself, calculated the number of vibrations of all the Chinese 7 whole notes, and began to explain that in the Chinese seven-toned octave, those whole notes called mi and si are not whole notes at all, but only half notes. Since the number of vibrations which they have almost coincides with the number of vibrations of those Greek half notes, which, according to the division of the Greek octave, are found just between the Chinese whole notes, re and fa, and between si and do. He made the further supposition that it was obviously convenient for the Chinese to have the restorio of the voice, that is, the center of gravity of the voice, also on these half notes, and therefore they divided their octave not into 5 whole notes like the Greeks, but into 7, and so on in this way. After this explanation of Mr. Gaidor-Ropoulos, as I have already told you, all the other contemporary scientists of new formation were completely pacified, having stuck a label also on this branch of their official science. And now among them, this branch under the name of the theory of the law of vibrations exists there, as our wise teacher, Mullah Nasser Aden, would say, in clover. About the given case I still remember, and willy-nilly cannot help expressing aloud that wise formulation of our always esteemed Mullah Nasser Aden, which expression he has in the following words. You Kufuristanian pantaloons, isn't it all the same to you whether you have a mule or a hare for your farm work? Haven't both of these animals 4 legs? These contemporary favorites of yours, of course, do not know, and do not even suspect, that these 2 independent divisions of the octave into whole notes, which they now have, and which they called the Chinese and the Greek, have as the basis of their arising 2 entirely different causes. The first, that is, the Chinese division, is, as I have already said, the result of the thorough cognizance by the great learned twin brothers, unprecedented on earth previously as well as subsequently, of the law of Heptaparaparshinokh. And the second, that is the Greek division, was made only on the basis of what is called the restorios of voice, which were in the voices of the beings Greeks of that period, when this 5-tone Greek octave was composed. Almost as many of these restorios of the voice, or as they are still sometimes named, light sounds of voice, are formed among your favorites, and until today are still formed, as there are independent groups into which they are divided, and still continue to be divided. And this proceeds so because these light sounds of voice are in general formed among the beings from many outer, as well as inner surrounding conditions, not depending on them themselves, as for instance, geographical, hereditary, religious, and even from the quality of nourishment and the quality of reciprocal influences, and so on and so forth. Your contemporary favorites, of course, cannot understand that however hard these same ancient Greeks tried, or, so to say, however conscientious their attitude toward this matter, they could not with all their wish find in the division of the octave of sound into definite tones either more or less than these 5 whole notes, since the totality of all the conditions not depending on them, both inner and outer, gave them the possibility at the reproduction of their chanting to rely only on their 5 restorials of voice. Restorials, or gravity center sounds in the voices of beings, are in general, and are called those notes which, during the reproductions of different sounds by corresponding organs, the beings manifest according to the properties fixed in them, and depending on the general functioning of their presence, which properties in their turn are the result of heredity and of acquired faculties. Freely, easily, and for a long time, without evoking any tension whatsoever on the part of other separate functioning of theirs. That is to say, in other words, the restorials are obtained when the tempo of the result of such a manifestation of theirs fully harmonizes with other functionings of their common presence, the tempo of which is already fixed in them, thanks to all the inner and outer conditions of their common being existence. Thanks to the various conditions there of local character, and also to various assimilated hereditary qualities, various restorials of voice, or gravity center notes, are formed in beings of almost each group or of each geographical place, and hence the division of the octave into whole notes among beings who breed on each definite part of the surface of this planet of yours is quite different. At the present time, among your favorites, such groups exist as have the capacity to reproduce the gravity center notes in the octave of sounds, not only in 5 or 7 gravity center sounds, but even in 13 and 17 whole notes. To illustrate what I have just said, the beings of a certain smallish group might serve as a good example who dwell on the continent Asia, to whose singing I personally very much liked to listen, and who in their physiological possibilities, although they had the data for the manifestation of only 3 restorials, could nevertheless, in their chanting, reproduce up to 40 separate definite sounds. Their chanting was extremely delightful, and at the same time, however lustily they might sing, yet the calm and sustained reproductions of the vibrations of sound were obtained among them only on one or other of these 3 of their organic restorials. This physiological particularity of theirs, namely, that whatever number of definite sounds they reproduced, the beings of this small group always obtained in the whole octave of their voice, only on these 3 restorials inherent in them, what is called the unchanging totality of vibrations. And that all during their manifestation, these restorials had the property of evoking what is called centralization, an echo in the whole presence of a being. I made very clear to myself when, having become interested in their chanting, I began to investigate this particularity, rare among your contemporary favorites, with the aid of 3 special what I call their tuning forks, which I ordered, and with the aid of several very sensitive what are called vibrometers, which I possessed, and which were invented for me personally by my essence friend Gornahoor Harharkh. In the Chinese division of the octave into whole notes, this being property was not at all taken into account. The basis of the Chinese subdivision of the octave into 7 whole notes, as well as the basis of all the information composing the totality of the special branch of knowledge relating to the law of ninefoldness, consisted of the results of those conscious labors and intentional sufferings of the 2 great twin brothers for which their higher bodies became beatified, and who now dwell on that holy planet on which we recently had the happiness to be. However it might have been there, my boy, yet at the present time, I regret very much that it will be impossible for me, with the contemporary sound-producing instrument piano, which I brought from the surface of your planet, to explain fully to you the laws of vibrations of all sources which actualize the common cosmic Ansapalnian-octave, as this was ideally possible to do on the remarkable Lav-Merz-Nokh, created by the follower of the great twin brothers, himself not less great, also a Chinese learned being, King-Too-Toz. On that remarkable elucidatory apparatus, Lav-Merz-Nokh, King-Too-Toz arranged and tuned, according to the corresponding calculations made by the great brothers, just as many strings for engendering vibrations as there are consecutive sources in the universe from any planet up to the protocosmos, in the presences of which the vibrations of cosmic substances changing according to law during the trogo-auto-egocratic processes blend correspondingly for the actualization of everything further. However, my boy, although the sound-producing instrument piano, which I brought from the surface of your planet, is a very typical invention of your contemporary favorites, yet owing to the fact, as I have already told you, that the fundamental tuning of the strings of its whole notes and half notes has not yet been changed. Therefore, according to the consecutive blending vibrations evoked in a corresponding manner by the strings on it, it might still be possible experimentally to demonstrate at least the laws of vibrations issuing from any one fundamental common cosmic octave of substances. That is to say, issuing from one of the 7 fundamental totalities of sources, and thanks to this, it might be possible to represent to oneself and to cognize all the reciprocally acting vibrations issuing from all other sources. Because, as I have already told you, all the variously scaled cosmoses, as well as the independent 7th parts of these cosmoses, are almost exactly similar to the Meglocosmos, and in each of them, the 7-fold sources of vibrations have the same reciprocal actions as proceed in the Meglocosmos. And therefore, having understood the laws of vibrations for any one center of gravity, it is possible to understand approximately also the laws of vibrations for all centers of gravity, if, of course, their difference of scale is taken into account. I repeat, if the strings of this piano are tuned correctly, and the corresponding vibrations are evoked in corresponding strings, then the resulting blending of vibrations almost exactly coincides, even mathematically, with the law-conformable totality of vibrations of substances actualized by corresponding cosmic sources on the basis of the sacred Heptaparaparshinokh. On this piano, the vibrations of each whole note and half notes of any octave pass from one to another exactly according to the law of the sacred Heptaparaparshinokh, and thus their vibrations. As this occurs always and in everywhere in the universe, exactly similarly mutually help each other to evolve or involve. Here, by the way, it will be very interesting to notice that if the calculations and enumerations obtained by these great terrestrial learned beings were almost exact, then they owe it to the fact that the standard unit which they took for their calculations chanced to be that unit which is taken everywhere in the Meglocosmos, that is, that same small particle of the most sacred substance, Theophany, in which there might still be all the fullness of the power of vivifyingness proper to it. Well, just here I will explain to you, as I promised, about the already mentioned Nar-Khra-Noora world sound. The Nar-Khra-Noora world sound is just that sound, the vibrations of which have been taken from ancient times, and even at the present time there is still taken, it is true, for a very small number of your favorites, of course, of this same China, for their sound-producing instruments as the absolute vibrations of the note Do. The history of the constatation of the existence there on your planet of this sound is as follows. It was first discovered by that learned member of the society Alkhaldan, which existed on the continent Atlantis, who was a progenitor of these same learned twin brothers, and who, do you remember? I have already told you, chanced to meet the first settlers of the country Maralpleicie, and was later elected by them as their chief. At that time, this same learned member of the society Alkhaldan, during his observations of different cosmic phenomena, which proceeded on and beyond their planet, constated that in a definite locality of a certain part of this country, just near that locality where the town Gob arose, twice a year, after certain meteorological perturbations in the atmosphere, the same definite sound always arose and was heard for a fairly long time. And therefore, he then on the spot constructed an elevation such as he required, as is said there, for the observation of heavenly bodies. And he constructed this required elevation on this spot because he wished during this observation of his at the same time to observe and investigate also this cosmic result, at first entirely incomprehensible to him. And afterwards, when the two great brothers, the later saints, constated and began to investigate the sacred cosmic law of Heptaparaparshinokh, as they already had knowledge of this cosmic result, they established themselves in the same place. And it is there that they succeeded in elucidating the character and the nature of this strange sound, which they made the unit of measurement of all their calculations in general. On these piano vibrations of extraneous origin come through different shocks and tremblings, and for the greater part from what are called aerial vibrations of inertia, which are generally formed in the atmospheric space by the natural vibrations already referred to. It is necessary at this point, in connection with the actualization of the fifth stop-pinder of the sacred Heptaparaparshinokh, to trace a parallel between two processes which externally have nothing in common with one another, namely, in the same manner as the first being food cannot acquire its vivifying power until after its transformation into being Pianchihari. In the same manner, on this piano, the vibrations of a chord do not acquire a corresponding vivifying power until they have been fused with the preceding vibrations produced. Starting from the center of gravity of the totality of the vibrations of the note soul. This last particularity of the sacred law of Heptaparaparshinokh is absolutely certain in this given case. That is to say, on the piano, but uniquely in consequence of the fact that if the vibrations of mi and ti are produced in a hermetically sealed room, these vibrations either cease instantaneously, or else the notes mi and ti, by reason of the momentum obtained from the first shock given for their arising, undergo involution and immediately cease. That is to say, as soon as the note mi reaches the note do and the note ti, the lower fa. In conclusion of the explanations that I have already given you relating to the subdivision into 7 tones of the octave of sound which exists among your favorites, I must once again, alas, insist on this fact, that if anything has remained and reached them of this knowledge, they have forgotten everything that was essential, and always for the same reason: the disappearance from their presences of the practice of actualizing being Partkdolg-duty, the same disappearance which is the very cause of the gradual deterioration in them of the mentation proper to 3-brained beings. At this point in his recital, Beelzebub became absorbed once again in his own thoughts, and his look was fixed on the tip of his grandson's nose. There was a rather long silence, after which he said to the latter, "Ah, my dear child, I must now speak to you willy-nilly about an experiment of which I was a witness on that same planet Earth, and which refers to the laws of vibrations. I shall moreover speak to you about it in all possible detail for the 2 following reasons. The first is because I have already said much to you about this first fundamental sacred law of Heptaparaparshinokh. I would therefore be very distressed if for some reason or other you should not succeed in understanding clearly the particularities of this law. This is why I now find myself constrained to hide nothing from you concerning these experiments, because I'm sure that they will enable you to form for yourself an exhaustive representation. And in the second place, I wish to impart to you all possible details concerning these experiments, because the terrestrial being who made them, thanks to the knowledge of cosmic vibrations which he had acquired, was the sole and unique being who, during the many centuries that I existed upon the earth, recognized and came to know my true nature.